Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Let's Talk Yoga podcast. Arundhati here, and I hope you're doing well wherever you're tuning in from. It's officially September, and I couldn't be more excited to start yoga teacher training this weekend. And I also know it's back to school season for some of you. Well, virtual school season, and I hope that transition is going as well as it possibly could. Today's episode is really exciting. I speak to Jesal Parikh from the Yoga is Dead podcast. She also does amazing work in the yoga world. She's a champion when it comes to appreciating yoga. And she's just been a fantastic voice in the yoga industry and she's been disrupting the industry. So we really get into it in this episode. She talks about ways in which we as yoga teachers, we can appreciate yoga and how to do better as yoga teachers. It's a fun, spontaneous conversation, and I hope you enjoy it. Hi, my name is Arundhati, and you're listening to the Let's Talk Yoga podcast. I'm an ex Bollywood dancer turned yoga and wellness educator. I've built a six-figure business as an immigrant, woman of color yoga teacher with no business background, no handstands, pure instinct, and the free information found on Google. If you love doing yoga and you dream of teaching it someday, this podcast is for you. We go over everything from doing and teaching yoga to scaling a small business, living a modern yoga lifestyle, and so much more. You'll find interesting, fun, raw conversations along with some tips, tricks, strategies, and insights in this podcast. So grab your cup of chai and let's jump in. Hi, Jesal. Welcome to the Let's Talk Yoga podcast. I'm so happy you're here today.
I'm so excited to be here. And Arundhati, I'm so glad that you launched this podcast.
I have you to thank for it. I think you were one of the first few people that I actually told about the podcast. And then I know you helped me out and gave me like solid advice about, I think a few months ago. I was still not sure I was launching the podcast, but your advice really helped. So thank you.
Yeah, I'm so glad. Anything I can do to support.
So before we jump into our interview today, right? I want you to tell us a little more about your story, about how you came to do yoga and eventually become a yoga teacher. I mean, I'm pretty sure most people listening have heard your podcast, they know about you, but just in case, what brought you to yoga?
Yeah, I think it's what brings most people, and that's like personal need, right? For me, my first exposure to yoga was probably in Hindu camp, like yoga as not all the cultural aspects, but like the practices. And that was like a Hindu camp that my parents sent me to when I was a kid, and I totally did not resonate. And then I did yoga again when I worked at corporate jobs. So I worked in market research for several years, and I was living in New York, and a friend of mine brought me to yoga. And I should say I was not athletic at all before that. And so yoga was a way to like really get into my body a little bit more. And it was really hard, but I also felt good at the end. So it kind of kept me coming back to it.
Oh, interesting. I didn't do yoga as a kid either. I mean, I only went to my first yoga class when I was like 25. So, yeah. How has life changed for you since the pandemic, Jaisal? Has there been a big shift or have things been pretty much the same? Because you teach a lot of stuff online, correct?
Yes, but that part of it is the pandemic too. So I think I was headed in that direction anyway, and I've actually had a lot of life changes. I moved from New York City and my husband and I, we bought our first home. We moved to the suburbs, which if you're in New York City, you would know that's like a really big deal to become to become bridge and tunnel, so to speak. Just living a quieter life, and I was teaching a lot of classes in person before the pandemic, so I had a lot of one-on-one clients, and I had one or two group classes I was teaching, and I've just let those go, and I've given them up over time to switch to the online. And again, part of this is driven by the move, but also shifting my attention into the online space.
Oh, interesting. And I was snooping on your Instagram as I was preparing for this interview, and I noticed you call yourself an industry disruptor. What is currently wrong with the yoga industry, and how would you say you are disrupting it?
Yeah, there's so many things wrong with our industry, so sadly. I think The first thing that I noticed, just overall, was like a lack of professionalism and a lack of respectful engagement in this industry. And there's like a very clear hierarchy that doesn't ever really get challenged because our industry essentially consists of these big gatekeepers like Yoga Alliance, IEYT, right? Things like that, some nonprofits that have some influence in this industry. And then we have all these little individual gatekeepers, like studio owners like yourself, right? Who get to decide who gets to be a teacher, when they get to teach, all of these things. And unfortunately, our the troubles of our society don't get removed just because it's yoga. And it took me a long time to figure that out. I had blinders on. I came into the industry thinking, "Oh, we must be like better because everyone's striving to be spiritually better." And then it turns out, no, actually, capitalism gets the best of all of us. And so we have, yeah, so we have the issues of racism. We have the issues of all the issues that capitalism bring in worker exploitation. We have sexual abuse. We have, and everything that comes with any spiritual practice, right? Those problems also come into the yoga space. And then we just have no accountability because of the structure of our industry. There's no one to say like, "Hey, you can't be a teacher anymore." Because our certificates essentially don't really validate anything the way they are now with Yoga Alliance. So it's not like a lawyer who like messes up and gets their license taken away, or a doctor who gets their license taken away, right? So there's just no accountability. That's a big issue.
Hmm. And it's like anybody can do anything with yoga, right? It's like, and Yoga Alliance, while they pretend to be some sort of a gatekeeper, I think they have to really step up and make some changes because they're honestly doing nothing when it comes to, if I can say this, protecting yoga.
Yeah, absolutely. They're just exploiting it. They're not protecting it at all.
Yeah, and I've been trying to, get in touch with someone in there to have these conversations openly about why don't you mandate cultural appropriation training? Because that's a really big part of if you're going to teach yoga to other teachers, you've got to talk about the appropriation of yoga. You've got to bring up some of these other issues that you just mentioned. Anyway, that's work in progress. I think I'm just venting at this point, but that's just
Well,
work in progress.
yeah, I'll say good luck. I don't have a lot of faith that that's going to happen, but I'll wish you luck in that endeavor.
I know, right? It's like sometimes I feel like in this regard, I might be hitting my head against a wall, but I'll keep you posted. If I make any progress, I will keep you posted. But you brought up really, really important things there because yoga teachers or teacher trainers like me and you, we get to decide who becomes a teacher. And that is really, it's a powerful thing. So it's important to make sure we do it right. And it's sad that, and I'm pretty sure you know this, right? Most teacher trainings here, they don't even test their teachers at the end. Like a doctor will have to pass certain criteria to eventually become a doctor. A physical therapist, everyone does, except yoga teachers. You pay for a certification and you're guaranteed to be a teacher in a few months. So it's a pretty weak system.
It's very weak, and the public, I don't think, is necessarily aware of this. Most students that walk into yoga class just assume that that the teacher had to go through some accountability system before becoming a teacher, and that's not the case.
So true. So true. I test my trainees before they graduate, and I make it really clear that you're paying for the training, you're not paying for the certificate. So if you don't pass your practical test, you don't clear your written paper, then you will have to retry. And I'm not going to give you that certificate till you are able to successfully do XYZ. And it turns out that I'm probably one of the few people who actually do it. Yeah, it's sad.
Yeah, it's so sad. It's so discretionary based on the gatekeepers, right? The individual business owners. And most business owners, even if they start with good intentions, usually just end up in this capitalistic cycle of realizing they can't meet the expenses that they have. And so they just succumb to, okay, just pay me and I'll give you the certificate. And it's just a sad cycle.
And there's this other side to it, right, Jesal, where studio owners, they convince students to sign up for the training. And I'm like, why would you just invite any random person into a teacher training? Like, shouldn't they have a certain amount of experience, a certain amount of proficiency in not just asana, but the other aspects of yoga? But yeah, yeah. Hopefully, with conversations like this, we'll be able to make small changes eventually.
Yeah, I hope so. And that's part of why, going back to your original question, I call myself a disruptor. I was actually just looking for a label that coherently describes all the disparate things that I do. And so I'm like, oh, I'm working on this random project here, and I'm working under Yoga Wallah to do this, and I'm working with Yoga is Dead to do this, and XYZ. And so I was like, what is it that I'm actually doing? And what I realized is my mission has become to just create a change for the better and to push these narratives that we often don't talk about forward because these issues get swept under the rug.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. I actually like the fact that you call yourself a disruptor. I think it describes what you're doing perfectly. That's why I snuck it into our questions today. I'm like, oh, I have to ask her. It's really, it's perfect. Why the name Yoga Wala, Jaisal?
So, yeah, this has an interesting story actually, because way back when, like many, many years ago, I had a food blog called Veggieella.
Oh, okay. I didn't know that.
Yeah, I did. And it's because actually a coworker of mine gave me the idea for the name because she had traveled to India and she was really familiar with Indian culture. And I was like, oh, I want to start a vegetarian food blog. And so she gave me this name. And then I ended up not following up with that after a couple of years, and my focus shifted to yoga. But when I was deciding what I should name my business, I did for some reason at the time I didn't want to do Jesal Yoga. I think because I grew up with people just not getting my name right. And thinking this might be easier. It turns out it's not necessarily easier, but I also didn't like calling myself a yogi. To me, there's some like visceral rejection of like calling myself that. I think because I think of that term as such a like having to earn that term through like dedicated practice. And I don't consider myself a yogi. I consider myself somebody who learns and studies and teaches yoga, but I'm not a renunciate. I haven't taken any sannyas or vows of any kind. I'm a householder, so I'm very firm in that I am a householder, and this is not something I'm not running an ashram or anything like that. And so to me, calling myself a yogi just didn't feel right. And I was like, what can I call myself, and what would I want others to identify as? Right? Because others don't necessarily identify with calling themselves yogi. If you're just a 9 to 5, not just, but if you have a 9 to 5 job and you doing yoga as just like a supplement to your life to maybe relieve pain, maybe find some concentration, you may not consider yourself a yogi or identify with that either.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. It's one of my pet peeves, actually, when people call themselves a yogi. I have discussed it earlier on the podcast and on Instagram and other places. I even wrote a blog about it once
I think I
about
read that
why,
after. Yeah.
yeah, about why I'm not a yogi and why you're not, like other people are not yogis either. But yeah, no, so
And
true.
so, yeah. So, and for folks that don't know, Wala is just in India, like somebody who does something. It could be a profession. It doesn't have to be a profession. It could be like, and it's also a last name in some cases because of like family profession. I've met people who are like ice cream Wala last name. They must have made ice cream. So I was just like, I'm just somebody who does yoga. And so are you, probably, likely, the people I was teaching.
Absolutely. At best, I say I'm a yoga student, but I'm not a yogi. I teach yoga, I share what I know, but I'm not a yogi. And, I mean, none of my teachers in India really call themselves yogis either. It was reserved for just a select few. It was not a term people threw around a lot.
Yeah. Or unless that's your name, right? Like there are people who are named yogi, which I always forget nowadays. But yes.
You can be named anything.
Yeah. Just to give some cultural context, some people's actual name is yogi. But yeah, it's not a term that's commonly used.
It's like how when someone's like some men have the name Guru, like Guru Prasad or something. And in my trainings in the past, people have asked me, they're like, at work, I have a guru, but does he have anything to do with, like an actual Guru Shishya? I'm like, nope,
Nope.
nope. Like how I'm Arundhati, he's Guru. That's it. Yeah. So I wanted to have you on to really help the listeners understand ways in which we could all start to appreciate yoga better. But before we get there, can you just talk to what is at stake if yoga teachers like you and me, if we don't start to make changes, what's at stake for yoga?
I mean, whenever I talk about cultural appropriation, generally speaking, what I like to do is reframe the conversation around who's being harmed. Because I don't want to I don't want people to buy into the saviorism mindset of like, I have power and therefore I must save others. That's not true. When we appreciate yoga, what we do is we save ourselves. We are actually we're practicing the yoga. We're realizing that we're all interconnected. And one of the things I like to say is, or like I had a conversation with Lakshmi Nair and we wrote a little bit about it in an article together, where we talked about when you don't appreciate yoga or you don't understand the culture, what ends up happening is folks in the dominant culture get harmed just as much, or not just as much, but they get harmed to a degree. Maybe not as much as us, but they get harmed in a way that is really insidious. Like I'll give you an example. So, all of this controversy, I guess I'll say, around Patabi Joyce, right, and his sexual assault or alleged sexual. I don't know if it's proven, that I forget. So alleged sexual assault, we'll say. I'm not saying that sexual assault doesn't happen in India. Of course, it happens in India, but in that yoga setting, I cannot really imagine, as somebody familiar with the culture, of Patabi Joyce being able to manipulate and gaslight me into believing that that was some sort of magical touch. Because in our culture, like that male female touch is so, it doesn't happen, not in public.
Yeah, forbidden. I was gonna say, yeah, not in public. Exactly.
It's
Yeah.
taboo. It's
Well,
taboo, right?
taboo. That's a better word. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's a taboo thing. It's not a part of our culture. And I'm not saying that's a good thing either. Like there's obviously regressive, suppressive things going on. But I'm just saying that if you're just familiar with that context, you're like, wait, this is not right. And if Patabi Joyce tried to convince an Indian woman that this was some sort of special touch from God, he'd have a harder time. I'm not saying he couldn't do it, but it would be a much harder situation to convince that that would be okay. And I think we miss that. Like when you don't understand that cultural context and you don't understand appropriation, we all get harmed.
So true. I never thought of it like that, but that's so true.
Or well, like here's another example. When people take away all the spiritual parts of yoga and you only practice asana, what is the difference then between yoga and aerobics?
Nothing, honestly.
Right, nothing. And then not that aerobics is bad. There's nothing wrong with aerobics, but the reason you probably came to yoga was probably different than what you came to aerobics for. And so when you take that away, you're taking away the opportunity to experience something different.
Yeah. And then yoga is just stretching or another gym class. And 20 years later, it's just one of those things that you do that is, it's just another fitness thing that people end up doing.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like if even if you don't, I'm not saying this is right, but even if you don't care about the South Asian community or you don't care about racism, like at least care about that at the minimum, right? Care that you are missing out on an opportunity to experience something really profoundly beautiful and different than what you may know. And that that's being taken away from you. And then layer on to that those other aspects that other people are being harmed and that this hierarchy is being reinforced, right?
Yeah. And I think people here, right, when they take something like yoga specifically, they just they try to make it in a form that they're comfortable with. So let me give you an example. Like just because you have to sit with your own mind in asana practice, for example, you play music and then you spray essential oils all over yourself and you just end up just masking one thing over the other and you try to numb yourself in many ways, and I think that's part of the problem too.
Yeah, I think with any of the tools of the practices, we it's so individual that we need to be asking ourselves like is this just the essential question of yoga and Buddhism too. Like is this avoidance or is this clinging or is this really just equanimity? Like and I'll give you I know that you wrote this great article actually in music and I have a slightly different take, okay?
Okay, go ahead.
I actually essentially agree that I don't once you become an advanced practitioner that you should probably not need music. But I've taught in a lot of settings. I've taught in gym settings and it's the only time people can get it in and I'm like, okay, if the music gets you focused in on us and drowns out like the guy on the treadmill and the person like lifting weights and throwing them down hard, it can be a useful tool. But I can only determine that to a certain to so such a degree, right? At some point the individual needs to tell me, "Hey, I've progressed my practice. I can now block those things out. I don't need the music anymore."
True, very true. And to the same extent, right? It's like if you were practicing, I don't know about New York City, I can only draw a parallel to India. Like if you go to a yoga class there, it's noisy. You can hear traffic, you can hear street vendors. I mean, it's noisy, and you have to learn to find your peace in all that chaos in many ways. So, yeah, and I think we should point this out, right? As yoga teachers, we all can disagree respectfully. You and I don't have to think the same thing
Same way, right?
about, yeah, about everything and then attack each other because we disagree. So I think, no, that's a great thing you brought up.
Yeah, and I just feel like, for me, it's like a tool can be helpful, but at some point, a tool can become a crutch. And so for us, we need to be thinking about like what's helpful, and then when is it a crutch, and then when is it just pure marketing and capitalism? Because that's the other part of music, right? Like I understand where you're coming from because I'm like, yeah, the mandated like loud blaring noise in a class, that's just part of marketing, and that's has nothing to do with trying to help your students access yoga.
Yeah, but in a gym setting, like you mentioned, right? And I'm pretty sure even if you played music, right, Jaisal, you wouldn't do boy band 90s playlist or
No, and
a
I gave
country
this
music night, something
I
like
gave this
that.
example to somebody else. Like when I first started out teaching, right? I thought that's what I had to do because this is what the model that was given to me. So I started out with these playlists, and I was like, I realized like after even just like a few months, I was getting distracted. I couldn't teach. I couldn't teach with that music, or even, and it's so interesting because music is so personal too. Like, a lot of Western teachers will play like Bharatanatyam music because they think it's, like, beautiful and calming, but I grew up dancing Bharatanatyam, so when I hear that music, I'm, like, choreographing in my head.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it happens to me too because of my Bollywood dance background. Any music that plays, right? In my head, I can't disconnect, and I'm choreographing, and I'm like in a class, and I'm trying to run out of that, like out of the class, so that music is not bothering me, but it's distracting.
Right, and so there is, like, this assumption that, like, even with calmer music, you have to be very careful, like, who is the person in the room, like, because music is so personal and it can trigger different memories for different people. We have to just be really careful and communicative with our students to see if something is really distracting or not.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, because you brought it up, like calming music. I lost my mom sometime last year, and since then, I can't listen to soulful piano or really slow music. It takes me to a place that's just really painful. So, yeah, and if I was in a class where already the yoga poses, they help you release emotion, and then this really sad music is playing in the background, I would have to leave at some point. But yeah. So, what would be the difference between cultural appropriation and appreciation?
So I like to simplify it as a starting point and just say that appreciation is giving and appropriation is taking. I think that's a very simple way to start to understand the concept.
I was going to say that's a great way of saying it. Yeah.
Right? It's just from like a very visceral, like simple way, and even in a relational way. So I like to always bring things back to like one-on-one relationships because I think sometimes we forget our society is just like a macrocosm of what we do in our micro life, right? So I just say like if you're with a loved one and you're always taking from them, you're taking their time, their energy, their effort. That's not going to feel good. That's a one-way relationship versus if you're actually, and then if you're taking from them, like you're saying, "Hey, can you make me dinner? Can you drive me here? Can you do this? Can you do that?" And then you're never giving, and then you're calling that appreciation. That person is not going to feel that that's appreciation. Versus if you're saying, "Hey, you're tired, let me massage your foot." Or you've had a long day, let me make you a cup of tea. Or let me fold your laundry for you. Or let me wash the dishes at your house. It doesn't matter, it's not my house. That's appreciation, right?
Yeah. Yeah. No, this is a really great way of understanding it, the giving and taking, instead of, those elaborate definitions about how to appreciate. This hits home a lot more. So, yeah, thank you for that. Jaisal, what has been appropriated in modern yoga? Just if you had to name a few things. I know there could be a long list, but just what comes to your mind when I say name three things or five things that have been appropriated?
What has been appropriated? The thing is, the whole practice has been appropriated. So it's not, we can parse it down into these individual things, but when we talk about appropriation, one of the things we have to bear in mind is this power dynamic, and then this idea of profit. And so the power dynamic, obviously being from a global structure or a global viewpoint, it's white folks, right? Because of colonialism and neo-colonialism and cultural imperialism and all these ongoing versions of colonialism. So let's not be pretend that they're gone. They still exist. They just exist in a different form. So if we're not keeping that in mind, then we're not going to understand appropriation. But okay, if we let's there's a dynamic of people who benefit from whiteness and who are categorized as white, and then they profit off of it, right? And so it's not like yoga is being profited by the people who, quite frankly, had to keep these practices alive under the British Raj who banned yoga, right? Or the Western countries who robbed India of all of its resources. Those are not the people profiting. It's the people who did the robbing that are profiting off of yoga. And so all, as a whole, it's being appropriated. And unless we address that inequity in where that money goes, then it's still going to continue to be appropriation.
So true. I was listening to this yoga history podcast yesterday that I discovered, and I don't remember the exact number, and this was during British Raj in India, right? Some several, like a trillion something dollars worth of loot was taken out of India.
This was the Vice video, right?
No, this that was the train video I think you're
Oh,
talking
okay,
about.
yeah. Because they named the number in there, the trillion, however many trillion.
Yeah, yeah. I'll send you this podcast I discovered. It's called the Yoga History Podcast. And I just heard episode 1, and he was talking about some $1 trillion. I mean, this was like 100 years ago and much before that. And it was shocking. It was, I mean, we all know it has happened, but just when you put a dollar value, it was more shocking, if that can be possible.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it is so shocking. And I want to, you just said something. It was so long ago. It wasn't that long ago.
Yeah, 100 something years ago. Yeah, yeah. It's not that long
There
ago.
are freedom fighters who are still living. Do you know what I mean? Like, I grew up, my grandfather's stepfather was a freedom fighter, and I grew up knowing him. You know what I mean? So it's not like it was that long ago. That into like I just like to put that into context that we still know people alive who were fighting under the British Raj, because that makes it feel like it makes it bring to light like that it's actually not like the effects haven't just gone away. It's not like just because it was 100 years or so ago that like it just ended. No, like my grandparents, your grandparents probably grew up under part of that, right? They were born before independence.
Absolutely. And like my husband, Karthik, his grandmother, while she was alive, she would always tell us stories of how she marched and how they hid and how they did stuff in the freedom struggle. And she was so proud of it. It was something every time she met me, she would tell me one freedom struggle story. So yeah, it's not that long ago. You're right.
No, and I think I had this like this dawning moment where I was like, my parents only were born less than 10 years after independence.
Yeah, mine too, actually. Yeah.
Less than 10 years. So do you really think they grew up without like the effects of that? Of course not. So I just wanted to say that because it makes it really real that like, yes, on paper, 1947 feels like a long time ago. It was not that long ago.
Yeah, yeah, you're right. Actually, you're so right when you say that. Uh, so let's get a little deeper into this. For a well-intentioned yoga teacher who wants to start appreciating yoga, what's the first easiest step they can take?
I mean, the first easiest step is to start educating yourself on the history of yoga, on the cultural context of the South Asian subcontinent, all of the different types of cultures, all of even the conflicts, right, that we face today. And to understand that like it is not a monolithic culture, to read the scriptures for yourself as best you can. I mean, not everybody has the ability to read in Sanskrit, but at least to read as many transliterations as you can get your hands on, and to really understand it from this philosophical point of view first and foremost. I think we jump to the asanas and we skip over the philosophy so often. And like without the philosophy, you can't really even understand what is yoga for ourselves, let alone what it is out in the world. And so I think that's one big first step. Another big first step is like to start to follow people and to learn from people with all of these different perspectives from the South Asian subcontinent. So even people you don't agree with, right? Like just follow them and see what they have to say.
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. And I think we have to talk about how Instagram is not the source of your yoga education, right? And I say this often, like, yes, that's a good start point to really, it's like a window into who you can learn from, but then go and actually do the learning, like just scrolling and reading and liking. That's not learning. That's different. And a lot of yoga teachers will have to probably rebrand also, right? Because if they understand they've been doing stuff that's been appropriating yoga for years, that they will need to rebrand. And I don't think rebranding is such a, I don't think it's negative. I just think it's growth, it's movement, you're just changing. But any advice for a yoga teacher listening who is looking to rebrand themselves after they're learning all of this?
Yeah, I mean, okay, there's a couple of layers to this because when I hear the word rebrand, I often think about people who are creating a brand, right? And usually at the center of the brand is themselves. And you have to ask yourself, like, if you're in a position of certain kinds of privilege, like white privilege especially, do you need to be centering the brand on you at this moment in time? Likely not. So a rebrand may be, how do you decenter yourself from the narrative? And it's not an easy I'm not saying there's an easy, straightforward way to do that, but like, there's another step to going even back to your appreciation versus appropriation. How do you start? It's through self-inquiry. Only through this lens of, like, "Who am I?" First of all, let me dig into who I am. What are my ancestral connections? Why am I drawn to this other thing, right? What is that relationship? What is yoga for me? Okay, now we get into the branding. Now, what is my role in all now that I understand myself better and I understand the context of the culture and I understand, like, why I'm drawn to this thing. What is my role in all this? Do I need to be centered?
It's not always about
Or
me.
can I just work on centering others? Right.
Yeah. No, so good. So good. I also read this post you made where you've said this before a few times where you talk about yoga teachers only teach the palatable parts of yoga. What according to you are the palatable or the popular parts of yoga?
I mean, asana is obviously the most popular part of yoga. And then even to some degree, like, maybe some breathing, maybe now meditation has become more popular, so meditation is coming around to what's acceptable. And then it brings it to what's not acceptable, and typically it is going beyond Yoga Sutras and Bhagavad Gita. Those are the 2 texts we read, and oftentimes, like, people don't go beyond that.
Yeah, they don't go beyond it because honestly, that's the only thing that's been sold in teacher trainings. And they're like, oh, check mark. Sutras, yes, I heard about Patanjali, I heard about the sutras. Oh, I kind of know what the Bhagavad Gita is all about. Check, check, done. There's so much more to actually studying yoga that these teacher trainings cannot ever cover.
I mean, and, like, I'll even ask you, like, what are your favorite sources, and then do you belong to a certain school? I think most people don't even realize, like, broadly speaking, there is dualism and non-dualism within the scope of yoga. And then even within the scope of yoga, you can still practice, like, Buddhist yoga, Jain version of yoga, like, all of these different overlapping connections to yoga because they all developed around the same time. So I even would ask you, like, do you have a couple of texts that you would recommend folks dive into?
Yeah, so for the history of yoga, right? I like the Yoga Tradition by Georg Feuerstein. It's a heavy read, but I do like that one. And in general, when it comes to finding high quality like yoga information, research, understanding the practice, I really like the books by the Bihar School of Yoga by Swami Shivananda Saraswati and Swami Niranjanananda Saraswati. Anything Bihar School of Yoga, those books for me are like gold standard, if I can say that. I really really appreciate that. And they have like the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, they have asana practices, they have fabulous books on pranayama, the kriyas, yoga philosophy. I mean, I can go on and on about how amazing their books are. They also have a really good book called Yoga and Kriya. So yeah, I mean, I can link these in the show notes.
Yeah, I think it'd be helpful for everybody, right? And I have several of those too, but I'd like to see what other ones they have actually.
Yeah, and I have like so many of those books. Sometimes I used to actually have books that I haven't even read. I've just picked them up now in excitement because I saw them on a
I
trip.
have
But
plenty of those. I have plenty of
oh,
those.
thank God I'm not the only one. But yeah, no, to me, those are really good quality resources. And then I'll link a few others that I read or have read in the past as well. So I'm going to move you on to, again, I'm focusing on that post you made because I think it was such an important post
Thank you.
about how to appreciate yoga. And you mentioned about spending time learning about the culture, the context, and the history of yoga, right? Can you remind listeners why this is so important with regard to yoga?
Yes, and it's important with regards to most things. I think that you're making your profession, first of all,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
right? If you're gonna become a yoga teacher, I think you should probably understand, like, what is the history? What is the context? But without context, how do we truly understand anything? Context is context. You need it to understand, to, like, really place it and to create a sense of discernment for yourself, right? Discernment is part of the practice, and if you don't have context, how are you gonna discern?
Yeah, I'm bringing that up because I've been or I've heard in, from students who graduated from other teacher trainings that these things are just not discussed, right? From history, the origins, the sutras, the eight limbs of yoga. These things are just sometimes left out. So, yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that.
I just wanna speak to that a little bit more because within yoga, again, there's so many different paths. And so if we're not discussing these things, what we're saying is that there's only one way to do yoga, and we're telling everybody that there's one way to do it. Versus, like, if you don't understand, like, what is bhakti yoga and where did it come from and what are the different types of bhakti yoga, and maybe you could be a bhakt. Maybe that's your path, but if you don't even understand any of that and nobody tells you, like, you don't know that's an option.
Yeah, yeah. And again, it goes back to you mentioning how only palatable parts of yoga are taught, right? And it comes back to that faulty teacher training model. And I know you and I can talk about that for a very long time, but you also mentioned dan and seva in your post and offering this to the South Asian community. I want to break this question up into two parts. Firstly, what is dan and seva, and is there a difference between the two? And the second part of my question would be, I have come across a few Indians and South Asians who really think they're just entitled to all things yoga. I mean, I saw this a little bit when I was living in India and also at the studio. I recently had someone reach out to me and very strongly tell me how yoga is her birthright, and she lives somewhere in the US, and she has to have the ability to walk into yoga classes and take teacher trainings for free, and she shouldn't have to pay for anything forever when it comes to yoga. But I think it's helpful for us to talk about this because we're not talking about giving away yoga for free, right?
No. And actually, I had a similar experience where I met somebody's mother who was visiting from India, in New York, right? And they wanted to learn meditation, and they scolded me for wanting to charge them. And, same thing. This is, you can charge for asana, but meditation is spiritual, so you shouldn't charge money. That was like the argument that came my way. And so this is kind of what went into the podcast essentially when we did the karma yoga or the karma capitalism episode. Like, that's one experience I brought to that episode. And I would say, okay, so Dhan, going back to your question, is charity and Seva is selfless service, right? And so at least that's the context I grew up learning it. And so for us, when and growing up as Hindus, right, we learned about Dhan as like whenever you have a blessing, you give back that blessing. So if you get a new job and you're making money, like you should give some part of that
Yeah,
to
pay it
either
forward.
charity, right? Pay it forward, exactly. And seva is again just this idea. It's the same as karma yoga, or it's very similar to karma yoga, right? In that selfless service without any expectation of anything happening in return. So just giving your time, giving your energy, giving your love to something and expecting nothing in return, expecting no outcome, even a particular outcome. And so what I'm saying is to give to the South Asian community in the context of yoga specifically, right? Because we're primarily talking about South Asian yoga, our culture. And so yeah, there should be some giving back again to those people, to the people who have held these practices and kept them alive and continue to fight for them, quite frankly. So I think that's that concept. And then wanting it for free, here's what I say to this. Yoga is free, obviously. Like you can sit and meditate as the Buddha did and reach enlightenment. That is for your taking. But guess what? You have to actually be disciplined. You have to bring that discipline to it. You have to earn it. Nothing in life is free. right? And I don't mean monetarily. I mean like you actually have to go and do things. If you want, your garden to bear fruit, you have to put in the work in the garden,
Yeah, yeah, it's not gonna come
right?
to you. Yeah, yeah,
It's not gonna come to you. You have to actually show up for it and you have to do the things for it. And so you can say you want this teacher training for free, but guess what? When you don't pay even a dollar for it in this society, right? We're set up with this capitalistic mindset. What you're saying is you don't value it, and you don't value that the teacher has to pay for their bills too, and that they're doing it in a convenient spot. Because you can learn yoga, you can go to the mountains, you can find some teacher in the mountains of India,
yeah, yeah. You can do it
right?
all by yourself. Yeah,
Right, where they maybe don't have to pay rent. But even then, right, going back to Dharn, like they're in this is why context matters. We've taken yoga out of its context. Not just here, but also in India, right? As India has become more westernized, this concept of dhan has gone away. It used to be like a patronage, right? So yoga teachers would be these wandering monks or at the ashram, and people as a society would recognize their value and give. That was the context. That context has slowly been stripped away. Right? So how can we say yoga should be free, 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 and then not even recognize that systemically that whole support system has been taken away?
yeah. That's really powerful. I was talking to my mother-in-law last night, and she lives in Dubai, and she's like 76 or something like that. And till today, she always gives, like she's always doing dan with whatever little means that she has, whether it's a birthday, whether it's a special festival, anything. Her first thing is to do some sort of dan. And that's been with her forever. And she's had a tough life. Her husband died when she was just like 30, 32. She raised two kids on her own and stuff like that. But I'm always so inspired by how she does dan all the time, unlike my generation, who is a lot more I, me, myself. So yeah, no, you when you said that, it just reminded me of that conversation last night of how she
But
gives.
I was thinking about Don a lot, right? When I put up that post, I was really thinking about it, and I'm like, you know what the concept behind it is? It's not saviorism. Like we often think of charity as saviorism. I have more, so I'll give you to those that are less. What Don really is I recognize that if you are not doing well, that's going to come back around on me. This karmic cycle, right?
Yeah, we all have to grow together. Yep.
Exactly. Like if you're poor, who are you going to steal from to survive? Me, right? You're going to steal from me. And then it's become going to become a ill of society versus recognizing, hey, I can help prevent that from happening by just being sharing in my wealth before that gets to that point.
True, true. And I think in yoga, right, we have a lot of, you can't live in isolation. It is you and your community, your society. You exist in this community. It's not only about I, me, myself. It's not about an individual person. It's about the collective good often.
Yeah, and that person who told me, right, like you shouldn't charge for meditation. Now imagine I was like, okay, I shouldn't charge for meditation. Okay, so how am I gonna live? Maybe like how Sadhu might have lived or Sannyas might have. Okay, I'm gonna put on robes and I'm gonna start begging. I'm gonna go to your doorstep and I'm gonna beg you for alms and say like, this is how then I'm gonna support myself living in New York City. You think you would give me money?
People would call 911.
Exactly.
So, yeah.
That's what the system is, right? That was like provided, saying like, okay, I can beg and you'll give me food because you recognize. When you take that away, I have to charge money.
Yeah, that's really powerful. I'm glad you clarified that because I think it's an important distinction to make. So, there was another thing you mentioned about building financial resources and equity into offerings. Can you elaborate a little bit? What were you talking about here?
I think here we need to just recognize that each of us holds privilege, right? And privilege is multi-dimensional and multifaceted. And so in the case of myself, like I recognize I am not black and I live in the US. So I hold that privilege. I am not of a caste oppressed. I'm not a caste oppressed person. So I hold that privilege. I have ability, right? I have all my limbs and I am considered quote unquote normal in my ability, right? Whatever normal means. And cisgendered. So I have all of these privileges. And so for me, if I'm going to recognize my interdependence with everybody else, I have to build in accessibility to those who don't have the same privileges I do into everything I do. This is something that and I didn't come out thinking this. I've evolved and my thinking is still evolving. And so now, almost everything that I do, there's some component of like, can I offer a scholarship? Can I offer some free education to people who don't have the same privileges I do? And reserve, make it very specific that it's, for the people who lack the privilege. And can I even then garner community support for these offerings if I'm not able to do them myself, like completely? Like, for example, if I'm holding a program and, I want to give away like $10,000 worth of education, I can afford to necessarily give all of that money away. So, can other members of society who are more privileged even than me help to support that? Right?
Yeah, no, that's good. I'm glad you brought it up. I kind of thought it was something along these lines, but I'm like, okay, I have to ask her. Okay, I'm going to bring us out of that appreciation post, and I will make sure to link it in the show notes for everyone listening. But apart from all the work you do with the Yoga is Dead podcast and you voicing or being a cheerleader for appropriation of yoga, you also teach a lot of yoga anatomy, and you are an anatomy geek. I mean, you've said this to me before.
Yes, I
What,
did.
yeah, why anatomy? What fascinates you about it?
I think what fascinates me is, like, anything, it's relevant to me. Do you know what I mean? Like, you get into things because they become personally relevant. And, like, I will say, like, in high school, we had an anatomy. I wasn't really particularly interested in anatomy in high school, but I became a yoga teacher, and primarily I started teaching asana because that's where you start in the States. And what I was recognizing, both in myself, my past experience going into classes, but I especially noticed this as a teacher, it was brought to my attention, was that the way I was taught to teach asana just wasn't fitting bodies, my body or anybody else's that I was teaching. And I think I was a little bit fortunate in that I wasn't teaching like the quote unquote typical yoga practitioner in my first part of my career. Like, I was teaching older folks because I lived across from, like, a facility, an older folks' home or assisted living or something. I don't actually remember, but I think it might have been assisted living, and they were coming to the class, and so they're even if they did yoga in the '60s and they were familiar, like, my cueing wasn't landing with them. I was noticing that. And then I started teaching privates very early because I needed to supplement what I was able to do. And so even that, so many people come to privates because they have injuries or they don't feel comfortable in the yoga class. And so I was like really struggling. I'm like, this isn't working. I was not a very good teacher, essentially. And so I wanted to just learn, how can I be better? How can I reach people? How can I reach myself? How can I teach this in a way that feels like it's applicable to all the bodies? And so that anatomy and biomechanics ended up being the tool that helped me to do that.
Oh, okay. Okay. Wonderful. I mean, anatomy is like a little bit of my blind spot, I would say, when it comes to just the technical side of it. Experientially, I can relate to it. But I'm so excited that you will be teaching in the teacher training that we're doing. But yeah.
Me
Okay.
too. I just wanna add that I'm also really excited because my teaching of anatomy and biomechanics has evolved so much with my own journey, and that I no longer center asana either. Do you know what I mean? Even in that, like, for me, the first place of inquiry and curiosity is around the nervous system, which is like, a friend of mine, the movement meister, Shante Cofield, says, "The nervous system is queen." And right? And it's so wonderful because the nervous system really is in charge of everything, and this is where it's so beautiful that it connects to yoga, because in yoga, we have so many tools to connect to the nervous system. Again, and if we strip all those things away from yoga, what we're left is like aerobics or regular fitness, but we're losing all of those amazing tools that give us so much power in creating health and healing and control in our bodies and all of that stuff. And it all starts with the nervous system.
Yeah. Yeah. So powerful. Thank you so much, Jesal. This has been really fun, and I'm hoping that we can have you back to talk about more things yoga. But if anyone wants to connect with you, where can they find you?
So they can go to my Instagram is probably the best way to connect with me. And it's at Yogawala with two L's. I'm sure you'll put it in the show notes. They can also find me at the podcast. I also have a website, which is yogawalanyc.com. So you can visit there. And I'm building out some more offerings in the next couple of months. So there'll be some cool stuff going up on that as well.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Jesal. I'm really, really happy that you came on this podcast. I'll talk to you soon.
Thank you, Arundhati. Yep.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for tuning in. I'll link all of Jasel's work and where she can be found in the show notes. That's available at letstalk.yoga. And just in case you have not heard this podcast before, we'd love for you to check out other episodes. Please rate, review, and share this with your yoga friends. I'll see you next week. Until then, take care. Bye bye.